right?
If I find it, I'll
Okay, we're live on YouTube.
Okay.
And
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Bridge Initiative's most recent, newest installment of Between Two Lamps, our lunchtime conversation about Islamophobia in the news. We're just getting our cameras set up, and then we'll begin. Once again, thank you for joining us at Between Two Lamps, the Bridge Initiative's live lunchtime conversation about Islamophobia. My name is Jordan Denary Duffner, and I'm here with two of my colleagues.
I'm Kristen Garrity-Shikarji.
I'm Mubashir Tazamal.
And thank you for joining us on this Monday. We've had a lot of news happen over the weekend that we wanted to discuss with you. As usual, we're going to be looking at events that have happened in recent days, and especially looking at how the media has covered those and responded to those. And the two primary events we want to talk about today, one happened just sort of in our backyard here in Northern Virginia. A 17-year-old Muslim teenager was kidnapped and killed after leaving the mosque after the evening prayer service during the holy month of Ramadan. So we'll speak about that. And then the second event is the van attack on Muslim worshippers leaving the mosque in London. So we're going to be speaking about that as well. Finally, we're going to go into in the next couple Between Two Lamps episodes this article on what some call liberal Islamophobia, and we're going to be analyzing some narratives that are often used even to counter Islamophobic narratives. But how they sometimes reinforce Islamophobic tropes and assumptions and things like that. So we'll talk about one of those sort of liberal Islamophobic tropes as well. But first, we'll go back to the news here in Virginia, in Northern Virginia, and the killing of Nabra Hassanein. So Kristen and Moby, can you tell us a little bit more about what happened and some of the reactions that we've seen in the media?
So it's being reported that late Saturday evening, or rather really early Sunday morning, there was a group of young Muslim teenagers, 17, at least that was the age of Nabra, who were out late after the evening prayers called Taraweeh, usually take place around like 10:30 at night. And it's usually a big community affair, so it's not, it's not uncommon for, especially in the weekend, young ones to be socializing and then, heading out to the 24-hour IHOP down the street or McDonald's, get some extra food when you can still eat before the fasting starts again. And so there's her and some of her friends were out, and apparently there was some kind of it's being reported as an altercation with a motorist, someone in his vehicle. Again, things seem to be unclear right now. But what is clear is that Nabra is no longer with us. Her body was found Sunday afternoon around 3 in a pool, in a pond rather, not too, in Northern Virginia as well. And someone was arrested and charged with her murder, a 22-year-old. So there's someone in custody, which is helpful, and hopefully we'll start to get some answers. And it's reported that Nabra was physically assaulted with a metal baseball bat. She was abducted. She was missing for hours. Law enforcement, community members are trying to find her, and it was discovered that her body was not too far away in a pond.
So she was with a group of people, and
Right.
they all ran, and it's looking like she was unable to get away, or?
It
Right.
sounds like from what I've seen, that she tripped over, she was wearing she was wearing an abaya, and she tripped and I guess was caught. And when all of the other people around her, they ran back and they reported it. It's my local mosque. It's Adam Center. It's the second largest mosque in the country, actually. They reported it, and then they contacted authorities, and they had been searching, but unfortunately it was around 3 p.m. that they found her body.
And it's, as of yet, the perpetrator is not being, or the one who's been charged is not being charged with a hate crime, just being charged with murder. So things are still this is still an evolving crisis, and we'll know more details as time passes and interviews are conducted. But as of now, it appears that the individual is not being charged with a hate crime, which is causing some distress, understandably, and some would say rightfully so among some Muslim communities, considering everything that's been happening, all the rhetoric, and just last month with what happened in Portland, when 2 young women, one of whom was Muslim and visibly identifiably so, another woman, a black woman, young black girl, they were being verbally assaulted and taunted by a passenger on the train, and some folks stepped in to intervene, and those two people were killed. Another one was severely injured. So, this is, and then not only this in the U.S., but we have what happened in London as well. A lot of things were happening yesterday and Saturday. So, Muslims are, the communities are on edge right now, and there's a lot of palpable fear. So this is just something that is just really hitting close to home for a lot of community members.
And I wanted to elaborate on that. It's the last 10 days of Ramadan, so a lot more people are going to the mosque. These are they're supposed to be the holiest days, so a lot more people are spending their nights at the mosque praying. So it seems like what they were doing is, going to McDonald's or IHOP, getting some food, coming back, and praying at the mosque again. That's what it appears like. And with the London attack, which we'll go into, it was people leaving the mosque from night prayers of Tarawih. So it's almost as if, entering and exiting a mosque is now becoming super, super dangerous during this month where, there's kids, there's families who are going because that's what happens. It's a time of heightened prayer. And for the local community, I think the reactions I've seen is that I'm from Northern Virginia. We didn't get any media reports on this. The first time we were getting information was through Facebook, through people that around the area who knew her, because it's a close-knit community, reporting that they found her body. That was the first news that I heard of. Looked all over Google, tried to look at our local media, wasn't hearing anything. And it's interesting also because she's a minor, she was 17, so there was no Amber Alert. That's also something that I've seen people brought up of why weren't we made aware of this until so much later. These are all things I think that we should also talk about, acknowledge. Right now, for those who are interested and who are in the area, there is a vigil planned for Nebra this Wednesday at 6:30 at Lake Anna, and I think they're having a national vigil. I think I saw in New York as well.
I just saw one DuPont scheduled for tomorrow evening, DuPont Circle here in DC around 6:30, I believe. There's some Facebook posts.
Another thing, to go off what you were saying, Moby, about sort of the danger that people have been facing upon leaving the mosque or going to mosque. This isn't a new thing. Last year during Ramadan, we had numerous cases throughout the United States of people being assaulted upon entering or leaving the mosque for Ramadan prayers, and so this is something that I really want our non-Muslim audience to understand and to recognize. I remember Aziz Ansari last year wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and he said, I shouldn't have to feel scared for my mom to go to her house of worship. And a lot of people have referred to this as a religious freedom issue. If people can't go to, and I myself have written about this, if people can't go to their house of worship without feeling in danger, that's a threat to people's religious liberty and freedom of expression and freedom of religion. And I would want our non-Muslim audience to try to imagine what this might be like if it were occurring in their own community. Not only hearing constant negative rhetoric about your religion and your community in the news, but then there being violent acts and attacks, outside houses of worship, children being assaulted and killed. I mean, this is happening across the country. Some cases get more media attention than others. So I just think it's important to recognize that this especially is supposed to be a joyful time for the Muslim community, and with events like this, it's really scary and concerning for many people. What did you both notice about the media coverage around Nabra's killing? What I know, Kristen, you and I were speaking earlier about some of the media coverage that you noticed. What did you see, and what were your reactions to that coverage?
So kind of, I guess, big picture coverage was there seemed to be a lot of back and forth, or hate. Was this a hate crime? Was this not a hate crime? Of course, many Muslims and congregants of that mosque in particular were saying, why yes. I mean, look at the rhetoric and just the political climate. According to law enforcement, this is not the case, so there's certainly some kind of back and forth over that.
Is it's not even being investigated as such, right?
Mm-hmm. I would assume not, if he's been charged only with murder and not with hate crime.
Yeah, they I think the latest I saw, the police department has specifically said they're not investigating it as a hate crime.
Okay.
So as of yet, no.
Okay.
And then in addition to that, we always here at Bridge like to help try to point out, kind of harmful tropes or stereotypes that kind of feed Islamophobic rhetoric or Orientalist rhetoric, which is kind of like seeing the Orient or Muslims or those in the East as somehow foreign and usually inferior in various different ways. So I have seen some of that being reported. So there was some, I can read a little bit from an article in Washington Post that just came out, and it was talking about Nabra's mother and how she was in her apartment, and a lot of people were coming to visit. And the article was talking about how there was, and this is direct quote, more than 30 women in traditional Muslim garb, sobbing and comforting one another. So it's unclear to me why it's necessary to mention their clothing and how they're dressed and their attire. It just seems completely, arbitrary. And, I mean, would you take any other community context? Would you comment on their jeans or their hairstyle? You know what I mean? So why is that? Why are we talking about this?
At a time of mourning.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it might seem innocuous, but it actually serves to
Reinforce that.
it otherizes and points out that this community is different.
Exactly.
That their wearing of this clothing means that they're different. It's pointing out a distinction that shouldn't be important.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And then there was some commentary about Nabra's level of how religiously observant she was, which again, I mean, that is completely unnecessary. And why are we talking about this? And it kind of feeds into these other conversations that often seem to happen after there's an incident of mass violence perpetrated by someone who is Muslim, and talking about how pious or devout or practicing or not practicing they are, and how that either confirms either state narratives of radicalization, or perhaps community narratives of, he's not really one of us because he's not a true Muslim, whatever that means. So again, I mean, this is a very different context, of course, but to kind of start talking about how religiously observant she was, whether or not she was practicing, just seems completely inappropriate and really in poor taste. And then, there was another comment about how she didn't typically wear traditional Muslim clothes, and this kind of, mentioning that, and then talking about how her mother had lent her the abaya, the long garment, which is being reported that she might have tripped over that, which is what made her susceptible to being assaulted.
And I can understand if, I could imagine the intention of this reporting was to say more than, I could almost imagine that they were trying to avoid playing into stereotypes with this reporting, by saying you know, they could have just said she was wearing an abaya and she tripped on it. Maybe they were trying to make her seem less foreign, and so they mentioned that she typically doesn't wear this clothing, but by even making that distinction,
Right.
they might actually have been falling into what they were trying to avoid.
Right. Exactly. So that's something that I've seen thus far in the reporting. So I would just, really kind of caution that kind of analysis and using some bunny ears there, just moving forward, especially when we're talking about gendered Islamophobia and how women are addressed in these kind of Islamophobic narratives and conversations.
And going off that, I just want to point out that visibly, Muslim women who are visibly Muslim wearing a headscarf are most often the victims of Islamophobia. Data shows that there are by far women who wear a scarf, black women, Nebra was black and Muslim, are, often the victims of Islamophobic crimes.
Yeah.
So just making sure people understand that as well.
Exactly.
So now I guess we can move to speaking about the Finsbury Park Mosque, the attack outside of the Finsbury Park Mosque, and I believe now one person was killed and at least 10 others are injured. Moby, would you like to summarize sort of what happened and then help us start off with the analysis?
So last night, as people were leaving Tarawih prayer, so it's usually 11:30, can be midnight depending on how long it is. People were leaving the Finsbury Park Mosque, and apparently an older gentleman had passed out or something, and they were giving him assistance, and a vehicle driven by a 47-year-old white man plowed into pedestrians. And there were, on social media, there was immediate reporting, videos coming up, showing people injured, people giving each other CPR, and they had actually, the Muslim congregants who had left had apprehended the perpetrator. There's videos of them holding him down, and there's a really wonderful video of the local imam from the mosque coming and, making sure no one attacks the perpetrator. They held him there until police came and they handed him over to authorities. And I think that's very important to point out, that this is how the community responded. And then I think from there, so they announced one person was dead, 10 people injured. Getting news of that was very slow. It really started off on social media. People kept asking, where's BBC, where's Sky News, where's the reportage? Usually when we just had a couple weeks ago the London Bridge attack, it was a massive, media outrage, and rightfully so. We got information and headlines and breaking news. This was much slower of a response, and the way it was worded, I think my biggest concern and problem I saw was a lot of articles saying vehicle collides with individuals who may be Muslim or something like that. Firstly, not identifying victims. A vehicle collides, it doesn't drive itself. There's someone driving the vehicle. Collides implies that two people met or something. This was deliberate. This was running into the perpetrator. When he got out of the van, he shouted, "I want to kill all Muslims." So it's on social media. There's witnesses who said that is what he was shouting. So for us, or for the media, to not acknowledge that, I think it's highly problematic, and it kind of reinforces this narrative that Muslims aren't victims to violence.
One of the things I've noticed over the last 12-15 hours is sort of the evolution of the media coverage, because I think initially, like you were saying, they were slow to, who knows if it was slow to get all the answers, but the presentation was different last night than it has been this morning. I know I was with my mom yesterday, and she was she looked at her phone and she said she read the headline and it was something like van attack or something in a in a neighborhood with that is like highly immigrant or something. And so it's like you could tell that the person writing the headline wasn't sure how they should cast this and wasn't sure whether or not the perpetrator was Muslim or not. And one thing that I found I found surprising, pleasantly surprising, was coverage on CBS News this morning. They referred to it in their big banner on the bottom of the screen as London Terror. Because one of the things we've been talking about in the office is sort of the inconsistency of usage of this word terrorism, and that it's really only acts committed by people who have a Muslim name or people who identify as Muslim that are considered acts of terrorism by the media and oftentimes by law enforcement. And this, it was very clear to me that CBS News was very much intentionally trying to cover this as they would have covered the other recent van or truck attacks.
And then I wanted to point out, they are classifying it as a terror attack. The latest I've seen is that's how they're investigating it. But
as you were saying, the
early reports were definitely very vague
and passive.
Yes.
Omid Safi from the Duke Islamic Studies Center shared something on social media that I saw other people sharing as well. He compared two headlines from The Mirror, which is a publication in the UK. He was comparing one of these attacks that was done by someone who identifies as Muslim. That headline was, "Muslim driver mounted pavement and plowed into 5 men after getting angry at, quote, racial abuse during Ramadan fast." The one for yesterday, the immediate reporting was, "Finsbury Park, 1 arrested and a number of casualties after van hits pedestrians leaving mosque after prayers." So it's interesting how the identity of the perpetrator doesn't figure into that reporting at all. Not saying it necessarily should. It's just
it's not consistent.
It's not consistent, and so people are pointing that out. And I think the media and politicians are also recognizing the need for consistency as well, because Theresa May, in kind of a surprising statement, said that we need to understand Islamophobia as a kind of extremism as well. So I wanted to read quickly from this Guardian article that's titled, "May says Islamophobia is a form of extremism, marking shift in rhetoric." And she said that this attack in Finsbury Park is, quote, "a reminder that terrorism, extremism, and hatred take many forms, and our determination to tackle them must be the same, whoever is responsible. As I said 2 weeks ago, there has been far too much tolerance of extremism in our country over many years. That means extremism of any kind, including Islamophobia." This is a marked shift, I think.
Although one has to wonder if any of it was due to her tepid response in the wake of the Grenfell Tower
Possible
fire. What happened there?
And going off of that, with the Grenfell Tower, it's been a really, I think, traumatic period for Muslims in London. A lot of the victims, a lot of the residents of Grenfell Tower were Muslim. Along with that, there were refugees, there were immigrants, there were members of, working class. It was a marginalized community that lived in there, and the response on that, also from the government, a lot of Muslims have responded and said, the response is, it wouldn't be the same if it was, rich residents, if it was a rich, flat complex. And I think that's also important to point out that people who were, when the fire happened, the first responders were Muslims. They were the residents who were awake for their morning meal, for suhoor, who woke up their neighbors, who ran through and were getting neighbors out. There were people coming from mosque who saw the fire happen, and they went into the tower. And the biggest thing I'm seeing on social media is no one's reporting the truth. No one's being told. They're not given answers. People are still missing. It's been almost a week. This happened Wednesday. And people still don't know where some of their loved ones are. And if you look at the building, it doesn't look like, I don't know how one would survive that. It's horrifying. They've released internal footage of it. and so there are still people missing, and the government isn't reporting or giving truth about what happened and what is going on. I think the latest numbers I just wanted to give out, I've seen 79 dead or missing, and the number is expected to rise on that as well. There's still many people missing.
I think one of the most alarming treatment of the attack outside the mosque was that in the same, usually in the same sentence as even introducing what was happening, instead of just calling it the Finsbury Mosque, which is what it is, it was reported that, you know, instead of referring it to it as its name, it was referring to it as the like Abu Hamza radical mosque, or like the 9/11 radical mosque, hub of extremist mosque. Yeah, it was, and someone pointed out, and even there's a really good compilation in a Mike article of pointing out this victim blaming and victim shaming. You know, why can't we just call it what it is? I mean, it's like this was a house of worship, and yeah, they went over a makeover, what have you. Many are reporting, but why do we need to?
Why is it significant?
Why do we have to go back and link it? Why do we have to somehow like cheapen the humanity of those who have been killed and who have nothing to do with whatever some preacher said a decade or so ago, you know? So it's almost as though even violence against Muslims can't be mourned or just left on its own right. It has to somehow be
tied into something else.
Yeah, exactly. Even in this New York Times article was talking about in the first paragraph how it is being treated as an act of terrorism by law enforcement in London, but it kind of qualified terrorism as an act of terrorism directed toward Muslims. So it's interesting that it even has to qualify this terrorist incident as, let me just be super clear, it was towards Muslims as opposed to, I guess, what is normally used as by Muslims.
It's like right. It's like it's surprising that terrorism is something that Muslims experience.
Yeah, exactly.
When we know that, if we look at groups like ISIS, Al Qaeda, and others throughout the Middle East and South and Central Asia, the majority of their victims are practicing Muslims.
Exactly.
And also pointing out state terrorism.
Right.
There's the global war on terror, and a lot of the countries that are suffering from that are Muslim majority countries, and so we never talk about state terrorism, and I think state violence is really important to highlight, and Muslims predominantly are the victims of it right now.
Exactly. And I think we can talk briefly about Tommy Robinson real quick too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to let them know who he is too?
Anybody want to take him on?
Is he the leader of English Defense League right now?
He was at one point, yeah.
Yeah. I'm
He's
going to
acting on another
categorize
scene.
him
Isn't
as
he Pegida now? I don't know.
Maybe?
he might. I'm going to categorize him as a right-wing extremist, like a hate preacher, anti-Muslim. He does like honor stuff with the Blaze, I think. Very, very extremist, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant in his views, and his response, or his commentary on the attack last night, I think, is very telling of his positions.
Right.
And I wanted to point out that, this perpetrator who rammed that van into these pedestrians, it wasn't just him behind that steering wheel. We need to address this growing platform that we have given to people that promote anti-Muslim views, and that is being churned out in our social media, on our media, given these platforms where they're even called upon as expert witnesses or experts on terrorism or experts on this or that, and they churn out such violent rhetoric. I think we need to acknowledge that there's more behind that steering wheel than that 47-year-old man.
Right, because even like a week or so ago, Tommy Robinson had some kind of social media video he posted about, Brits need to take matters into their own hands. Really veiled, not so veiled threats about, against Muslims and in response to what happened.
And these are people with mass social media following, so they have a large platform.
Huge platform. And in response to the attacks, he on Twitter he said, before people start aiming hate or threats at me about this revenge attack at your mosque tonight, he calls it a revenge attack. So first and foremost, he said, "I've warned for years what you will create." He said, "The mosque where the attack happened tonight has a long history of creating terrorists, an article jihadists, and promoting hate and segregation." So he, he's been,
He's essentially saying they deserved it.
he deserved it, and he said, yeah,
That's
they had what was coming, and so, we have folks like that across the Atlantic, we have folks like that here in the U.S.
And that's ultimately what Islamophobia is.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the perfect example. It's saying here's something that someone a Muslim has done. No, let's blame everyone else for it.
Exactly.
And I think to go off of that, one of the arguments that I wanted to highlight from the article we'll talk about coming in the next couple of sessions on Between Two Lamps is the liberal Islamophobia arguments. And one of the arguments I'm also seeing, and I've seen articles on it, is this will play into the hands of ISIS. Islamophobia plays into the hands of ISIS. And I think a lot of people don't realize how problematic that is. And this article says that in this framing, Islamophobia is considered objectionable mainly because of how ISIS might exploit it, rather than for its own intrinsic violence.
Yeah.
Islamophobic statements are represented as a trigger or pretext for Muslims' violence, rather than as something that is itself a source of violence, like illegal and aggressive wars, extrajudicial drone killings, torture, secret detention, hate crimes, invasive state surveillance, and so on. So, while Islamophobia may be the immediate object of critique, it is still Muslims and their supposedly terroristic propensities that feature as a fundamental problem in such narratives. As a result, the argument redirects attention away from Islamophobia and back towards Muslim violence, even while claiming to do the opposite.
Right.
So I think it's really important to take note of that.
And that was something we saw during the 2016 election.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton, that was kind of her main her main thing. Barack Obama a little bit too, but she especially would say, Islamophobia is wrong because it plays into the hands of our enemies. No, it's just wrong, period.
and the thing I think is it predates ISIS. Islamophobia did not come about when ISIS came about. Islamophobia has been present, you could go back decades. It originates with the whole Orientalist discourse. It's evolved from that. Islamophobia and Islamophobic crimes have happened before ISIS ever existed.
And we're just as bad.
We're just as bad. So I think it's important to take note of before you make that sort of argument that it can be Islamophobic itself.
Yeah, and I think also there's in addition to this, this happens with a lot of minority groups. There's this turn to try to make a minority very respectable and to really bolster their really positive virtues and qualities. And I think we saw a little bit of that. And I think we saw some of that happening with the rhetoric about the mosque and how it was initially being so uniquely tied and linked to radical, what have you, elements. And then there was some there was some pushback in saying, actually, this mosque won an award for counter-extremism, work, and Christian pastors go there and they visit and they do interfaith at New York Times. I'm not kidding. Last paragraph. So that's all well and good, but what is what's happening when we're doing that, and what maybe we can unpack that a little bit, because even if they didn't win an award on counter-extremism work, and even if Christian pastors didn't do interfaith work there, it doesn't mean that those parishioners were any less worthy of humanity.
I think it serves as a dehumanizing element.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it makes Muslims seem either you can potentially become a radical, or you're actively fighting that radicalization.
Right.
That's all you can do. Those are the two things. And that makes it so you're not human, you're not complex, you don't have feelings or emotions, and you're not worthy of feelings or emotions.
Exactly.
That's extremely depressing.
Yeah, it's very depressing.
Yeah.
And it's your worth is tied to how you're related to
A narrative.
violence.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then how random external components what you wear, what kind of facial hair you have is
How often
tied.
you pray.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because even reports of the driver of that van, reports were coming out saying, oh, this clean-shaven driver.
Yeah.
This clean-shaven terrorist driver.
It's a clean-shaven driver
Why?
of van.
Right, why would you need to distinguish, I mean, we know why, but why would you need to distinguish the level of their their 5 o'clock shadow or not? We know why, but kind of feeds into that.
And
rhetoric.
I think going off of that, I wanted to, another things that I was seeing with the headlines is, as we were getting more headlines, it was unclear who this perpetrator was. You got the clean shaven, you got the 47-year-old man. We didn't know his name, we didn't know his age, we didn't know what church he went to, if he went to church. When if it's a Muslim perpetrator, we know their age, their name, what mosque they're connected to, we know where their family lives, and that is all in the headline or within the first paragraph.
Yeah, the most recent, or the London Bridge attack before this one, the first paragraph of a New York Times article said, the son of immigrant parents from Libya.
Yep.
Right.
Like,
Right.
Son of immigrant
can you
parents from
imagine,
Boston, yep.
like, if, the son of or the, son of parents from Philadelphia, like,
It essentially criminalizes the entire family or anyone connected to that person.
in the country.
And the country, and then just fills into this larger thing where the individuals, if they're Muslim or immigrant or people of color, they're grouped into that group. That's it. You were part of this monolith. You were not given an identity for yourself. You're not allowed to have that. Whereas this perpetrator, who committed this crime at Finsbury Park Mosque, 47-year-old white man is all we've gotten, and that is how we should be reporting these things. We shouldn't be identifying like, oh, his age, his full name, here are his parents, this is the mosque he goes to, this is the church he goes to, this is the school he went to. We start getting all this biographical information, and it's I don't think it helps finding it helps with us learning about the motive or understanding what was the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
It kind of creates more of a fear. It kind of criminalizes communities. It does criminalize communities. We've seen that with the Muslim community. And this is around a time in London where, the Muslim community has been facing hate crimes have increased 5-fold, I think, since the Manchester attack.
I think it was the London Bridge.
Since the London Bridge attack. And that is a drastic increase. And it's not just, massive incidents of violence like this. It's harassment on the street. It's being spat on. It's being verbally assaulted. It's kids being bullied. This is happening on all levels. So I want people to acknowledge that and take note of that. That's not just, oh, Finsbury Park Mosque happened. This is an everyday occurrence for Muslims. And this just heightens that fear for us here in, I live in Northern Virginia, having, the murder of Nabra just really hits close to home because this is our community. Going to prayer, you hear about, take precautions, don't walk alone, be aware of your surroundings. And now, that really, really hits home of like, are we not allowed to go eat at IHOP at 3 a.m.? That's a lot of groups do that. I used to do that with my MSA and undergrad. We used to go to IHOP at 3 a.m. to eat. So are we not supposed to do that now? I think I want people to understand the impact of this on the community that's already been facing so much, in response to the rhetoric that we hear on TV, in the media, read in the news.
I just wanted to close with an article from the Huffington Post, a contributor there, who wrote an article that I think is kind of thought-provoking, and it might be an interesting way for us to conclude this Between Two Lamps episode. It has sort of a controversial title that struck me, and so I read into the piece. It's called "The Danger of Confronting Islamophobia to Its Face."
Mm-hmm.
And at first I thought, this is interesting. We see our work as confronting Islamophobia. So what is this author saying? But she was talking about the sorts of incidents like we saw in Northern Virginia, like we saw in Portland, and it's recommendations for how bystanders can aid Muslims who might be experiencing anti-Muslim Islamophobic harassment. And the writer M.K. Ansari says the best way for bystanders or victims to stand up to Islamophobia is not to necessarily be a physical hero and respond by kind of standing your ground and being forceful and using your body and fighting. The thing that folks should do is to try to get themselves or the victim away from the situation and call the authorities. There's been some great actually like cartoons or graphics that give some good advice for bystander trainings for how to best how to most safely respond to these sorts of incidents. So I'm sure folks have a lot of different thoughts about this sort of response, but I thought it was a thought-provoking one. And it doesn't mean that you're not confronting or addressing or standing with the person who's being harmed or harassed. It's just how do we mitigate the physical harm as much as possible.
And I can speak from experience on that. On Inauguration Day on the Metro, I was verbally harassed by a group of people around me on a metro train. So you're in a closed space, and it was ongoing, the harassment, and I was ignoring them. I wasn't responding, but it kept building and building. And luckily, there were two young women who came over and just blocked. They stood in front of me with their backs to the people who continued to harass me the entire time, to kind of create a physical barrier, and their back was turned to them. And then they were engaging in a conversation with me to try to take the attention away, so I wasn't paying attention to that. And it did, it calmed the situation a little, made me feel safer. And I think it's important that in closed spaces like that, I don't think being confronting that is the best scenario, especially if it was a group of, I think, 6 people, older. So it wouldn't have been the best response on a closed metro train that's moving to confront them or engage with them. So just having that barrier for bystanders who just came in, stepped in, kind of asking how your day was, kind of just pretending that's not happening, which obviously it's really hard to do because I couldn't get it out of my head. But yeah, that I saw the headline to that article, and a lot of it I was like, I could understand that.
Well, and one of the things that the author says here is that hate isn't a reasonable discourse. It's not something you can argue with someone about. And so I think her argument is to not engage verbally or just to create a safer space. One of the recommendations that I've also read elsewhere is pretend like you know the person. If you're a bystander, you see it happening, pretend you know them. Say, oh, hey, sorry I was late, or hey, so-and-so, is that you? I didn't, funny to run into you here. Because when a perpetrator thinks that a person has a community around them, they're not as likely to continue that targeted harassment.
There's some other good tactics too. Apparently one of the most successful tactics, according to a local bystander trainer group, is to break out into the "I'm a Little Teapot" song and do the movements, because it just totally changes the tone and completely de-escalates the situation.
I don't know if I could do that.
That's pretty brave.
You just throw off the perpetrator. They would just be so confused.
They're like, I'm done. So
I'm just imagining that now.
Not to make light of a situation, but apparently that has been exceptionally successful. If you can remember that song.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll keep that one in mind. So we're gonna wrap things up here on Between Two Lamps. Nazir, do we have any comments or thoughts from social media? Any questions people want to address? Nope? Well, that makes our job easy. So thank you so much to Nazir Harb-Michelle, our social media wrangler and senior research fellow, and our intern, Ali Panjwani, for helping us out today as well. Again, my name is Jordan Denary-Duffner, along with Mobashir Tazmal and Kristen Garrity-Shakirji, and we thank you for joining us for this installment of Between Two Lamps. Join us next time. Thank you.
Have a safe last few days of Ramadan as well.
Eid Mubarak in advance.